Okay, so I am going to give you a little overview of the 1700s, and then we're going to jump into our one example of Rococo art, and we'll talk about what that means too. So first, let's just talk about just big picture. Here we are in the 18th century. That means the 1700s. And what we're looking at is the big changes are coming. So we are really in what we want to call modernity now. Now, modernity, it begins earlier in truth, like when we really there's a lot of debate about when we sort of say like the modern period begins, or modern history. But a lot of folks are going to put it in about the 16th or 15th century, really with the beginning of the Renaissance and then the Protestant Reformation in Europe. But it is really kicking here in the 1700s. So what do we mean when we talk about everybody says like, yeah, definitely 1700s is when we get into like, this is modernity, or we're hitting all the marks of what we mean by modernity. So what do we mean? It's associated with kind of this focus on the individual and individual pursuits. So what we want to call like the individual subject. That the world can be explained scientifically and rationally. A decline in emphasis on religion, right? The emergence of things like of governmental bureaucracy, of rapid urbanization, the rise of the nation state as the center of power. And we have this really accelerated financial exchange here in the form of capitalism and communication. So what we might call the beginnings of globalization. So what is the sort of, what are we looking at here? So we have to go back a little bit earlier to the 1600s, after the 30 Years' War. After when that ends, remember the 30 Years' War was incredibly devastating to Central Europe here. I think, as I mentioned before, 40% of the population of Germany dies either in the fighting or in the famine and disease that results after the war, during the war. But the treaties of Westphalia end that war. And in Westphalia in 1648 is really when we see what we consider the beginnings of the nation state. So you're going to start seeing places like basically one of the things that you can't do after Westphalia. In the 30 Years' War, countries would hire mercenary soldiers to fight their wars. After Westphalia, all of like France and Germany, like everybody agrees like, okay, you have to have your own standing army. So this is where we get the idea that the military is linked with the nation state. And sort of borders get solidified and all of these sorts of ideas that we think of when we think of, well, what does it mean to say somebody like that this is the nation of France, or this is the nation of the United States, or whatever it is. It comes out of that. Okay, so we've got that. We've already seen that there's been this major change in economic systems that began in the 16th century, which we call capitalism, right? And becoming the dominant economic force. In part because now, once we get into the 1700s, capitalism is going to be sped on. You know, we see it, it's born up here in Northern Europe, but it's going to be spread through because capitalism works hand in hand with imperial expansion, right? That's sort of what spurs on imperial expansion, is to get new markets and new points of exploitation in order to, right, extract materials, extract labor, etc. So we see imperial expansion, and the other thing that really spurs on capitalist development is the Industrial Revolution. So we are going to see how these sort of changes affect how art is made and who it is made for. As we already saw in Northern Europe, we move away from patrons asking for art to be made for them to art being produced to be sold on a free market, on the art market. And then also we're going to see art beginning to comment on the lives of humans under this political economic system, because now, as we have the Industrial Revolution, we're going to have a lot of people moving out of the country into cities to work in factories. And that's going to be a major change in the way human everyday life works in Europe. And artists, of course, are going to be commenting on that. We're going to be seeing imperial expansion, as I mentioned. We've already seen how that played out in the art of the Spanish Empire, which you talked about with Dr. Farish last week. Um, we are also going to see how this contact with Asia, with Africa, with the Americas are going to influence is going to influence European painters. Um, then we have the scientific revolution. I've given you some timelines here, stuff, right? Like, so nation states. Here's my little point for the scientific revolution. And with this kind of turn to thinking about science and the scientific method, what that also implies is a changing relationship to religion and God, right? So that maybe looking away from religion as an explanation for how the world works and towards science to explain, phenomena in the world. We also have our Enlightenment thinkers. So I've given you Immanuel Kant here, but these are all of those guys: Rousseau, Locke, right? All of the Wollstonecraft, all of your Enlightenment thinkers that you remember. And our Enlightenment thinkers are going to change human understandings of power, right? So if you think about these guys, like people like Rousseau and Locke, changing the way that people think about how they should be governed and whether they should be governed through the absolute rule of kings. And this is also why in the 1700s we start to see our revolutions, right? The American Revolution, the French Revolution, and sort of changing the way that we think about who is supposed to be in power and why they're supposed to be in power. We're going to see a change, and we're going to see some art that deals specifically with the age of political revolution. But in addition to the Enlightenment thinkers kind of changing how we think about government, in the arts specifically, we're going to see this movement of romanticism emerge as a reaction to the scientific revolution, in terms of like thinking like, well, maybe this is overly scientific. And instead, we want to think about, instead of science, we want to think about emotions and imagination and intuition and nature as a way to understand the world and the human spirit. And the Romantics, so they're kind of like a reaction against all of these, intellectual philosophers. And the Romantic movement, it's going to reach us in art, but it begins with the poets. So people like Wordsworth, Keats, Byron, Shelley, Coleridge. I'm thinking about a Wordsworth poem, I wandered lonely as a cloud, and it goes, for oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. Okay, so that's an example of like the mood, the vibe that's going to be happening for our Romantic poets who are going to influence our Romantic painters, some of whom I believe you are reading about over the break. So that's what we've got coming to us. So let's take a look at something that precedes the Romantic movement, but proceeds. So it comes after Baroque art, but it comes before Romantic art, and that is Rococo. So Rococo, here we have our exemplary Rococo artwork, Jean-Honoré Fragonard's The Swing. Where do we get the word Rococo? We combine the words Baroque, which is the Italian for the imperfect pearl, with rocaille, which is the French for a garden, a kind of garden that uses like shells and pebbles and rocks in this really elaborate way to decorate the garden. In Rococo, the patrons are... so what happens is, as we've seen before, patrons increasingly are not royal or the church, right? As we saw in the north, right? Think about in Northern Europe and the Netherlands. Who's buying art there? It's not the church. It's not the Catholic Church because they're not Catholics. It's not royals because they don't have a strong royal family up there. Instead, who are we seeing? We're seeing people like wealthy merchants, the bourgeois, right, etc. And this kind of spreads beyond this sort of move towards art being marketed to the wealthy, spreads in France, because in France, after the death of Louis XIV, the French court moves out of Versailles. The court moves back to Paris. So they're not being held, all these aristocrats are not being forced to live in Versailles out with the king. They can move back to Paris. And all of these courtiers decide to build these really ostentatious, beautiful townhomes in Paris. And every week they host these fabulous intellectual, artistic, basically cocktail parties at their beautiful homes in Paris, in their salons. Like the salons are the rooms they have for entertaining other aristocrats. So they want art for these salons. They want this sensual, luxurious, ridiculous, over-the-top art with sort of stories of, romances and stories. There's like really lots of ornamentation, beautiful flowers, fluffy clouds, pretty gardens, little chubby little angels everywhere. So that's kind of the style that they like. So the guy who sort of originates the style of Rococo is Jean-Antoine Watteau. Here you can see his feast of love, right? Like you have all these kind of wealthy people hanging out in a garden, kind of looking like they're getting ready to make out with each other in lovely silks and satins, beautiful landscape, right? So that's Jean Watteau. And then we've also got Francois Boucher. Boucher gets his start as an artist by actually copying the paintings of Watteau, and then kind of comes into his own. Here you see again, right, romantic scene. Here's the goddess Venus with cupids and putis and bright colors, sumptuous fabrics. And Boucher is the teacher of Jean-Honoré Fragonard. So here is Fragonard's extremely famous The Swing. This painting is 32 inches by 25 inches. Fragonard was especially known for he specialized in these scenes of love and passion and with a kind of like cheeky, almost risque sense of humor. He was also known for his mastery of color. I mean, and this is really, this pink of this woman's dress just beautifully pops against this scene of greens and blues in the garden. He really does a wonder. You can really kind of just, she's really this focal point of the image. So before we get into the story that we have here, Fragonard was a student at the French Royal Academy in 1752. He doesn't actually get to join the academy until 1765. Remember, the French Royal Academy was instituted under Louis XIV as a way to kind of codify like what proper art would be. So we've moved beyond the guild system to the academy for trading artists. So he gets into the academy in 1765. In the intermediary time, he studies in Italy, so he gets a lot of influence in Italian works. He works for aristocrats. That's who he's painting paintings for. And he gets a lot of work after Boucher dies. So after Boucher dies, like people go to Fragonard to get paintings painted in this style. So originally, this was meant, the person who was supposed to get this commission was this guy, Gabriel Francois Doyen. But when the patron was like, this is what I want you to paint, Doyen was like, that is so tacky. I am not painting it. It's scandalous. I refuse to do it. You know who would love to do it? Is Jean-Honoré Fragonard. That seems right up his alley. And that is indeed who the patron goes to and has Fragonard paint this painting. So what's the story here? So we've got this young, beautiful girl on a swing. And as you can see here, she's being pushed on the swing by this old man who's back here kind of almost half hidden. And he's pushing her on the swing. And as she flies higher and higher, oh, who do we see? But her lover, who's hiding in the garden, who snuck into the garden here and is hiding in plain sight. And as her, husband here pushes her ever higher on the swing, it gives her lover a better look up her dress, right? So he is looking right up her skirt here. And in this moment of her being pushed up into the air, lover looking up her skirt, and she flings her shoe off and her scandalous naked foot and, titillating ankle there for her lover to see as her shoe flies off. And we have Cupid up here sort of raising his finger to his lips saying, shh, like, I won't tell, your secret's safe with me. And we've got two little pooties over here. These are meant to be statues, but of course they're kind of in the scene to show that it's about love and passion. The scene itself is kind of meant to invoke a comic opera, like the set that a comic opera would be at. This was the patron. Now, I mean, it doesn't look like the patron. He's anonymized, but this is the guy who wanted a painting of his mistress, with, the husband that they were making a fool of in the background. So you can see it does have this kind of, when we think about art that's made to be pretty and decorate a very beautiful Parisian salon for parties for the French aristocracy. This seems like it's it. So Fragonard's super, super popular until the French Revolution, at which point he dies alone and penniless because nobody wants this kind of, bourgeois propaganda art anymore. So enjoy it while it lasts. Okay, that's it for this one.